Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Transition Cow Secrets What She Wishes She Could Tell You webinar. My name is Catherine Garcia, and I will be the moderator for the webinar. We want to make sure you're familiar with our webinar layout, so take a moment to locate the Q&A area at the bottom of the Zoom screen. This is where you can submit questions during the webinar. Questions will be answered at the end of the webinar, and any questions we are unable to answer will be responded to via email after the completion of the webinar. Also, a short survey will pop up when you exit the Zoom webinar today. Please take time to complete the survey just to let us know how we did, as well as some future topics you might be interested in hearing from AgSource. Note, we will be recording this webinar and sharing the link afterwards, so watch your inbox for a follow-up email to view the recording. In 1959, AgSource was formed to serve Wisconsin dairy farmers. That began as a regional dairy records processing cooperative has now grown into the AgSource of today, serving industries that span the entire agricultural ecosystem. From cutting-edge soil, plant tissue, and water testing, agronomic consulting, and full-service DHI testing, AgSource at its core is a source of truth. One test at a time, we help our clients make the best decisions, always grounded in data. I'm now excited to introduce our speaker for today, Talia Danziger. Talia leads the data science and education team as a dairy intelligence lead, residing in Durand, Wisconsin. Talia is a graduate of University of Wisconsin River Falls, where she double majored in agricultural education and animal science with a Spanish minor. She is currently pursuing a master's degree in dairy science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In her role, Talia performs dairy herd data evaluation and educates producers, industry partners, and academia on the applications and analysis of data provided by AgSource and VAS software solutions. Talia brings on-farm experience to her role as a herd manager for a 300-cow robotic dairy and her ownership in a small dairy farm. I'm now excited to turn it over to Talia to get us started.
Hi, I am Talia Danziger with AgSource, and our topic for today is Transition Cow Secrets, What She Wishes She Could Tell You. One of the really amazing things about milk testing is the amount of data we collect on all of our cows. Every time we test, we are creating hundreds of data points on our cows that we can then use later on to understand what she needs from us as managers. And the focus of today is going to be how to look through all of that data we collect every time we test to understand what our cows are telling us about their transition. A quick look at our agenda is number one, finding that hidden value in our fresh cow data. And number two, looking at our keto monitor results. Another great thing about milk testing is that we have been getting keto monitor data on every cow coming through our AgSource milk lines for a number of years. And not only do we know whether or not we found her to have ketosis on test day, we know when she left the herd and where she peaked for milk. And by having all of that additional data, we can truly understand the impact of ketosis on our cows. First off, how do our fresh cows let us know that there's a problem? A lot of people are going to look for the classical things like milk fever or ketosis, but there's lots more data at play here. And we can really separate this data out into 5 different areas here. The first, udder health. Here we are going to look at fresh cow new infections and dry cures. In reproduction, we often look at pregnancy rate at first service and dry period length. Diseases, we start to go into some of those classic diseases we just talked about. Ketosis is the one that we can find through our milk testing results, but we also might do things like measure the amount of milk fever or RPs and metritis that we see on the herd. From a management perspective, we can look at our transition cow index, or TCI. That would be an exclusive AgSource value. And we can also look at our turnover. And finally, in production, we look at things like peak milk and persistency. Now, not one of these things happens in a vacuum. So when we see something like high fresh cow new infections, we are likely going to also affect our production. And those fresh cow new infections might be associated with another disease. And when we start to get into this web of data, it can be a little bit harder to interpret where the source of our problem is. And that's one of the other things that we're really going to look at today. Why do we care so much? Well, there are a lot of dollars associated with each of these areas on the farm. Let's consider production. If we lose 1 pound of peak in a first lactation animal, we're going to lose $66 per first lactation cow at $22 milk. So that adds up really, really quickly when we look at all of the milk that she could or would produce throughout lactation. When we look at udder health, we know that every case of mastitis costs right around $450. So it's pretty easy to see how that's impacting our dairy. Reproduction, we usually figure that every extra day open costs us $3 to $5 per head. We know that every case of ketosis, generally speaking, costs us $289 between the production losses associated with that and then treating and getting that cow to recover. And from a management perspective, if we can increase our herd by 1,000 pounds of TCI, we're actually going to see about 2,400 pounds of increased milk per animal and 2.65% reduced turnover. So all of these things can be huge profitability drivers for our farm individually, and even more so when we consider their cumulative effect. There are subtle hints that opportunity exists in each of these areas, and so we're going to explore each of these kind of piece by piece and talk about the most important data points that we can be looking at to determine where that opportunity is and how our farm sits. Let's look first at measuring our management influence. And the two things that I want to focus on here are TCI and turnover. Just a quick reminder on TCI. We calculate TCI by looking at that last test before a cow dries off and that first test when she calves in and comparing those two values. When she dries off, we actually look at a number of different figures on that animal. How much milk she's producing right now, what her days in milk were, and we create an estimate for that cow. So maybe at dry off, we estimate that next lactation, she's going to be a 28,000 pound cow. She dries off, calves in, and early on in lactation, when she's hit at least 5 days in milk, we create another estimate for her. Maybe this time we actually estimate her at 30,000 pounds. She's actually a plus 2,000 TCI cow. She is doing better than we expected. We really set her up for success in transition. This cow is going to produce approximately 2,400 pounds more milk in her lactation. However, it could go the opposite way. If we look at cow 8839 down here, she's a negative 2,000 TCI. So something happened in that transition period where we failed this cow. She's going to come in and perform more poorly than expected. We also print back a number of different values here to try to give us an idea of why her TCI might be low. This cow might have a few things going on. Her dry period was on the shorter end of normal, and she's a fourth lactation cow, 11 days in milk, only milking about 66 pounds. So there is something holding this cow back. We can look at TCI on the individual cow basis, and we can look at it at a whole herd basis. And this is where we really want to monitor the effects of our change. And we can have change that is intentional or unintentional. So here, when we look at the way a herd is performing, we interpret this by considering both the center point of these bars here, which would be our 50th percentile cow, but then also the direction of our trend and the length of our bars. The best thing to do here is pretend that there are lots of individual dots on each of these bars that would be individual cows and their TCI that they got on that test. We lop off the bottom 25th and the top 25th percentile of cows, saying we're going to have some outliers and that might skew our data. So we're really looking at the trend of that middle 50% of our cows. If our cows are experiencing a really similar transition, we should see nice short bars. If our cows are telling us that they're all experiencing kind of different transition stories, we're going to start to see some of these longer bars. So in this case, we had cows with a negative 1,500 TCI all the way up to a positive 4,000 TCI. These cows are all experiencing something really, really different in that transition period. The other thing that we want to watch for here is the trend that a herd is experiencing. So let's consider the trend that this herd here is experiencing and what these cows are telling us. Every cow on this herd is telling us a really different transition story. We are seeing the length of these bars increase. And so we're seeing more cows at the top end and more cows at the bottom end here. We can back that up by looking at the actual number of animals calving and the average TCI for this herd. Now, I always want to be a little bit careful with averages because averages can hide what's really happening. If half of our cows are low and half of our cows are high, our average is going to shake out somewhere right in between, and we might have a false feeling that things are going really well on our farm. So in this case, with this example, when we look at that distribution here, that starts to tell us that there's something going on in our animals. And when we start to see these really negative average TCIs, we know that it's time to investigate. One of the first things that's really easy to investigate is looking at our number of animals calving to make sure that we're not seeing any impacts of overcrowding. In this case, we're not really seeing that on this herd. We need to look somewhere else. One of the other associated management pieces that we need to look at would be our turnover. We want to be tracking those culls less than 60 days in milk. These animals went into a dry period. So we have fed and housed them for probably around 60 days, and they've come in, calved in again for us. And if they leave before 60 days in milk, they likely haven't even peaked yet. So we're missing out on the highest production potential for these animals, but we also might be missing out on the opportunity for them to pay us back for that dry period. So we really, really want to track these animals. This here is an example of a herd that worries me. Our turnover rate has been too high over time. We really need to understand why these less than 60 days in milk cows are leaving. We can look at our trend here over time, and then also our averages along the bottom here. So you can see for the last year for this herd, our overall turnover rate less than 60 days in milk is 19% for sold and dyed, and our dyeds are at about 3%. We actually print back our industry benchmarks right in the header of this report. And you can see that at a sold and dyed rate of 19%, we're actually falling down below the bottom 20th percentile. This herd definitely has a reason to be concerned here, and this needs to be addressed on this dairy. All of this data can be found on the fresh cow summary available from AgSource. If we're worried about this, there's a couple different places that we can look. We can examine our stocking density to see if we're having extreme calving fluctuations. And we should look at some of our other indicators. Do those low TCI animals have a high somatic cell that we know that udder health is affecting them? Do we see high fat to protein ratios that we should be suspicious of ketosis? Can we track our disease events overall and see if we're seeing an increase in any other disease events in our herd? We did talk here about high somatic cell being something that can play into TCI. So let's jump into udder health as a whole and look at our new infections and dry cures. First off, why do we care so much about fresh cow infections? This is a chart that I absolutely love from Dairy Comp here. What I'm doing is plotting a lactation curve for older cows. So I've got my animals greater than lactation 1, looking at those animals with a first test somatic cell score equal to or less than 200. So that would be my 4 statement, the top line here, the red line, with those older cows with a first test somatic cell over 200, so our infected animals. And that would be the width line down here, the blue. And we can see not only is that first test better for those animals that did not come in with an infection, they peaked higher and they sustained that higher milk production all the way through lactation. So if you consider that the blank space between that bottom blue line and that top red line is all lost milk potential that we can track back just to having a high first test somatic cell, we have a lot of opportunity when it comes to preventing udder health infections. Just so that we're on the same page with terminology, there's a couple different terms that I'm going to use. One is a fresh cow new infection, and those are cows that dried under 200,000 and calved over 200,000. This could also be a heifer that freshened into her first lactation over 200. We didn't expect her to come in high, and she did. A dry cure then is a cow that dried over 200,000 and calved under 200,000. So she went into her dry period with an infection and she came out clean, or she cured. Sometimes we talk about dry period failure to cure, which would kind of be the opposite. So she dried over 200,000 and calved over 200,000. These cows worry me quite a bit too, because if we used dry cow antibiotic therapy on them, if we tried to cure them in that dry period, we made an investment to do so. She has not paid us back for that investment. And so we have to be sure that we are treating the right cows and that all of our protocols are right for our farm. There's a couple different things that we can look at here. The things to keep in mind here are both our trend and our distribution. This is off of our fresh cow summary as well. And I really like the way that we track fresh cow new infections and dry cures on this report. We look at them by lactation group, which is really important. Our first lactation animals have likely been living in slightly different conditions than our older cows up to that point of calving. So we want to track those fresh cow new infections for first lactation separately than those older cows. You can see overall, we're trending higher on this herd than we'd expect. We're at 28% new infections in first lactation, 22% new infections in older cows. But I've highlighted a point here where things really shifted for those younger animals. We went from 8 and 9% new infections up to 24%, 15%, and they've stayed high for the rest of the year. Now, that same shift didn't necessarily happen in those older cows. That shift to higher infections actually happened a few months later, and those same months were actually some of our best months for dry cures. So we're seeing very different patterns in our data here that should make us look at different places on the farm. Another piece that we can look at here is our first test linear score by fresh month. I have a line here drawn at the 4.0 mark because a 4.0 is equivalent to 200,000. We want to keep all of our dots and our lines below that number. Here, we can see not only that 50th percentile, so where are we netting out as a herd, but we can also see that distribution. And we can see here back in March, we had a really wide distribution for our older cows, some coming in with a very high first test linear score and some being just about normal. So it's not just the trend, but it's also that distribution that matters. And our expectations really differ by lactation. Our first lactation animals should be the lowest somatic cell animals in the herd. Their teat ends should be clean and in good condition. They haven't been exposed to milking parlor equipment and things over time. And they should have the lowest level of pathogen exposure. If we think of the contagious mastitis pathogens that can get swapped around in our farm, our first lactation animals have had the least amount of exposure to those pathogens. And when we see things like the chart on the right-hand side here, where first lactation is continuously higher than older cows, that really makes me concerned. And I'm going to investigate things a little bit differently than if this was reversed and our older cows were actually the ones with the most prevalent infection levels. What we really need to do here is examine what our affected populations have in common. Is it bedding? Is it the feed? Is it the parlor order? By understanding what these animals share, we can do a better job of going to the source of the issue rather than just treating those high somatic cell animals. When we listen to our cows, we can really start to enact some meaningful change. Here's a really interesting chart looking at dry cow cure rates for one farm over a couple-year period. Now, I do apologize that the color of the bars changes from year to year as we were running this report, but it is all the same herd, all the same data here. What we're looking at in this case is our dry cow cure rate. So if those animals went into the dry period with an infection, what was the likelihood that they came back out clean? We want to be over 80% dry cures. So we want all of our bars to be above this dotted green line. And you can see here, not only were we below the line, but we really started decreasing over time. We actually had a conversation here in November on this farm and made some changes that caused our dry cures to increase. However, the problem had been going on for quite a while by the time we talked about it in November. We really should have started listening to our cows back here in April, where we saw a few consistent months below that 80% target. Similarly, We saw some improvement. We never quite hit that 80% target. And then we saw a decrease here again going into summer. So in this particular dairy, we actually had another conversation here right around August. And instead of continuing to decrease, we made some changes and we were actually able to get this herd at a dry cure rate, very close to and hitting the benchmark here. So by having these conversations at the right time and discussing what the root cause was for these low dry cures, we were able to make some changes here that really had a positive effect on these dry cures. If we think back to those lactation curves, we're going to see not only a reduction in cows that we have to treat, but we're also likely going to see an improvement in the milk coming out of these cows because they are calving in with no udder health infection. So they are ready to rock and roll and make some milk for us. Where do we look when we see these problems? When we consider that fresh period or dry period, we want to consider those failure to cures. What is the most prevalent mastitis pathogen on the farm? And does our dry cow treatment cover that pathogen? Another thing to look at here is our use of teat sealant. If we're using it, that's great. When was the last time this was audited? Are we sure that we are administering it correctly and our teat ends are clean when we insert those tubes? Also, what does our bedding supply look like this year? If we're not already using teat sealant, is this a good place to make a change to our protocols to make sure that we keep our cows clean if they go into the dry period with no infection and we prevent a new infection? One thing that's neat about this area is that it could be a no-cost or low-cost area to fix. If we just simply aren't doing a good job administering our dry cow antibiotic therapy or using our teat sealant, we audit that process and we retrain employees, that costs almost nothing to fix and can pay us back in dividends. We also need to consider what else is happening to our fresh cows. We know that there is a link between ketosis and high somatic cell. So what we think is a high somatic cell issue could actually be a ketosis issue. However, we really need to pay attention to this because our fresh cow new infections or failure to cures can have the biggest impact on the lactation yield of all mastitis occurrences. We are hitting these cows when it counts, before they go up into peak milk. So we really need to be paying attention to this particular area of infections. Moving on to reproduction, most of the information that you need to assess reproduction and the way that I'm going to talk about it here actually comes from our herd summary. If we look at the back page of the herd summary, hopefully these are some familiar charts and graphs. There's a few different pieces that interact here that really tell the story on a dairy. The first is that calculated voluntary waiting period, and that is based on the 95th percentile of breedings. And this is the value that we use for the rest of the calculations on the back of the herd summary. When do we really start breeding our cows? That number is actually used to calculate the first eligible cycle, where we look at our service and preg rate on that first insemination in our cows. This is also related to our average days in milk at first breeding. If we are a synchronized herd, we want these two values to be within 10 days of each other. That essentially means that we're getting all of our eligible cows inseminated on their first eligible cycle. And finally, the ultimate thing that we're trying to affect is our preg rate. If we look at our service and preg rate in that first cycle, that is what's going to really drive our annual average service and preg rates. So we want to make sure that our service rate is high. The only way to get a cow pregnant is to get her inseminated. And we also want to monitor those preg rates and ensure we're seeing a high preg rate when we've got that high service rate too. So are we being efficient in our inseminations and getting cows pregnant when we do inseminate them? So this is a herd that's doing a pretty good job, especially in that first service. But we have a different herd here. In this case, we've got a herd with a 55-day calculated voluntary waiting period. So that's the value being used to calculate the values on their first 21-day cycle. We have a service rate of 92%, but a preg rate of only 36% on this first cycle. So we are breeding a lot of cows, but we are not seeing a lot of pregnancies. And that actually ties in down here to our annual averages, where our service rate is 42% and our preg rate is 19%. If we go back a slide, this herd had a service rate of 46% with a preg rate of 28%. So not a huge difference in service rate, but a really big difference in preg rate. And that is going to be a profitability driver. One thing that we can look at here is that calculated voluntary waiting period. Is this right for this herd? But there's another piece of the puzzle here, and that would be days dry. I'd be really curious on this herd to do some investigation on days dry. We typically expect to see 90% of our cows in that 40 to 70 day range here. Instead, we're only seeing 71%, with quite a few short dry periods and quite a few long dry periods. This makes me concerned because when we think of these short dry periods, these cows have not necessarily had enough time to go through involution of their udder. We don't know that these cows are set up for a solid next lactation. In these long dry periods, we've got cows that are maybe set up to get overconditioned and are going to have similar issues going into their next lactation. Except for these cows, we're more likely to see our metabolic diseases that can then have an impact on reproduction. So we don't want to try to solve this problem in a vacuum. We're getting semen in our cows, but they're not getting pregnant. So we need to look at when we're inseminating them and whether or not we're setting them up for success. What numbers should we monitor here? One of the first ones I always like to look at is voluntary waiting period. Our calculated, so what is that 95th percentile of breeding? So what's actually happening on the herd versus our stated voluntary waiting period. When did we say we wanted to start breeding our cows? I want to look at our preg rate by cycle. So a high service rate should also correspond with a high preg rate. We want to make sure that we are inseminating our cows at the right time and we are having some effective use of that semen in our cows. And we also want to see a high preg rate and high service rate on that first eligible cycle, especially for a synchronized herd. We really want to be watching preg rate as a value. This is more reliable than looking at things like days open on pregnant animals or services per conception on pregnant animals. Both of those other values look at animals that are already pregnant versus preg rate is a better way to determine where pregnancy is headed on our dairy. We're considering all of the animals on our herd. Finally, dry period length here. This is a good reflection of our current reproductive performance and a predictor of the future. If we're seeing a lot of long dry periods, is that because we have trouble getting our cows pregnant? They get out late in lactation, they drop in milk, we dry them off early. We end up with that snowball effect of then those cows that maybe get overconditioned in the dry period, calve in with a metabolic issue, we struggle to get them pregnant, and we have to dry them off early again when they drop in production. So not only is this telling us what we've done in the past, but if we can't break that cycle, it can tell us what direction we're headed in the future. Looking at disease, keto monitor is one of the best indicators of disease, specifically ketosis on the dairy. And I really like bringing in keto monitor because it's a great unbiased indicator of what's happening in a herd. So this is an events grab from Dairy Comp for a herd. And if we look at their fresh cows over time, we're freshening between 80 and 100 animals per month. It looks like we don't have much of an issue with ketosis. Only 9 ketotic animals, over 976 in a year. So at first glance, this might look like we're doing really, really good. However, when we pull in that keto monitor data, that same month that we saw for them a spike in ketosis, we had 3 possible cases. We actually saw a 42% prevalence of ketosis. Now, prevalence is the equivalent, or incidence is equivalent of 2 to 2.5 times prevalence. So if we actually want to know how many cows got ketosis in the month of July, we'd have to at least double this prevalence level. So it's more like 80+% of animals had a case of ketosis this month. That's a far cry from 3 out of 79. So this is a better indicator of what's actually happening on the dairy. And this is what we should be using as we're doing some other troubleshooting on the herd. One thing that we want to consider is how we are adjusting to what the cows are telling us. This is about 2 years of data for a herd. It's the same herd. And we're actually seeing a really distinct pattern over time as to when they're struggling with ketosis. In this case, you can see going into the fall months, we see a sharp uptick in ketosis in our older cows. Our older cows would be these green bars. What happens in September, October, November? In this case, it was fresh corn silage. This herd did not have enough carryover and had to start feeding that fresh corn silage right away. And after a few years of seeing this performance from their cows every year, it made sense to start looking at inventories and trying to keep a little bit more carryover to prevent this in the cows. But we also have a different pattern here. Out of the blue, we started seeing an increase in first lactation animals that we really wouldn't expect to see much ketosis in. And that's why it's so important to be constantly watching these numbers, not just blood testing cows or treating cows that have visible signs of ketosis. We really care about these subclinical cows and these patterns because they tell us where we need to look and what we need to do for interventions. Another tool here would be our fat to protein ratio. In this case, we are comparing fat and protein as components, and we want to stay below this 1.4 threshold when we compare the two. This particular herd has had issues for quite a long time. You can see that they're consistently trending above that 1.4 line. And down here, we've got our goal of being less than 40% of cows with a fat to protein ratio greater than 1.4. And this herd is consistently above that goal, with 67% of first lactation animals coming in with a high fat to protein ratio, 62% of older cows. And you can see here too in their distribution that most of their cows do fall above that 1.4 line. This is a herd that really requires some intervention. It's not just this test, but it's the long-term history for this herd. Where should we look? First of all, we want to determine those affected lactation groups. If we're seeing this in first lactation cows, that's usually a bit surprising and unexpected for us. And that's going to require some different intervention. We want to understand what patterns we have to know if we have some seasonality to this. And we should also examine our common themes. Feed facilities and management oftentimes transcend all of our lactation groups. And so we should examine what of these might be affecting our cows. Is there something that we can change in any of these three areas to drive those ketosis numbers down, or any of the other diseases we might be considering? We focus on ketosis here because we have some really strong indicators out of Keto Monitor. And finally, let's look at production. This is how we get paid, right? This is ultimately what helps us determine our future and the decisions that we're going to make here. Why do we care so much about fresh cow diseases? Well, we already looked at this chart here, those animals that calved in with a somatic cell over 200 and how they performed versus those animals that calved in under. But here's another chart looking at retained placenta. Again, that top line are those animals that did not have a retained placenta versus the animals that did calve in with a retained placenta. So we need to correctly identify the source of our production problems. And this too, I think we can end up looking at the wrong thing, where we could look at nutrition as an issue. We could look in all the wrong places when really we've got maybe a disease problem or a somatic cell problem. It's not always the same solution, but the data can point us in the right direction for solving that problem. The first thing I want to talk about here is peak milk. And I talk about peak milk a lot because every pound of peak is so valuable. Every pound that we can drive in a first lactation animal is going to be equivalent to about 300 pounds in our lactation. Every pound we can drive in a second plus lactation animal is about 250 pounds in her lactation. So every pound of peak that we can squeak out of our cows is going to pay us back in bigger lactation yields all the way through. And let's examine an association here with days dry. So I set up some codes in Dairy Comp. What we're looking at here is cows with a dry period length 40 days or less. Those cows 41 to 69 days, they're going to have a code of 50, so basically the middle point for days dry. And then those cows 70 days or over are the 70 code. You can actually see here, only 54% of our cows had a normal dry period length. Those are also the cows that performed the best when we looked at peak milk and projected milk values and average ME. But let's focus here on short dry period lengths. We had 37 animals with a short dry period, and their average peak milk was 102 pounds versus 110 in those normal lactation cows or normal dry period length cows. If we're going to do some cow side math here, that 110 minus 102 is an 8-pound difference from where we expected. That's actually 2,000 pounds of milk per cow. We multiply that out by 37 cows. That actually gives us 74,000 pounds of milk production potential. To convert that to our hundredweights, we're actually going to divide by 100 and then multiply by 1750. I kind of picked a lower mailbox milk price here. Our milk futures have been looking a little bit rough right now, so wanted to be a conservative estimate. But that actually gives us almost a $13,000 direct loss due to those short dry period lengths. And this is something that doesn't cost a whole lot to fix. If we just change our protocols a little bit and dry these cows off and give them more of a normal dry period length, we could really capture some profit opportunity in that next lactation. We don't always need to compare against each other. Looking in lactation groups here, we can actually compare against some of our benchmarks. In this case, when we compare this herd against their goals for their peer size, so we're looking at herds over 1,000 cows here, you can see that they're falling pretty close to the bottom 20th percentile for all of their peak milk values. Now, we don't want to stop there. We want to tie this into other things happening on the farm. We know there's opportunity to improve, but when we look over here, we have a lot of short dry periods. So are those short dry periods driving some of those lower peaks in those older cows? Similarly, if we look at the lactations, in late lactation, we start to see those cows really drop off for milk production. I like to see late lactation to be 90% or higher for percent of last milk, and this herd's in the 80s on those older cows. We also have a lot of long dry periods. So are our cows dropping off too quickly and getting dried off early because of low production, and then coming in and having peak milk issues due to things like ketosis as well? There's a lot of different pieces of this story, and we want to be sure that we're considering all of the right pieces of data here to make sure that we don't make the wrong change, especially an expensive change on this dairy that doesn't address the root cause of these problems. To recap here, we looked at data in a few different areas: the management of our cows, our udder health, our reproduction, our diseases, and our production. And you can see here too how every one of these areas impacts the others. So there's not one piece of this that we can solve in a vacuum. Everything that we do is going to affect something else. And again, we really want to make sure that we're finding the right root cause of our problems and connecting all of those data points. One way that I want to connect those dots is through Keto Monitor. So Keto Monitor can really help us connect the dots with our transition cow health. What I want to do here is really take a deep dive into collateral damage. So we have data on all of our individual cows and herd level subclinical ketosis, and that data has been collected since 2015. We know a couple things here. First is that the standard cost for a case of ketosis is $289. And second is that the standard benchmark is to have less than 10% of our herd with subclinical ketosis. We were asked, though, is ketosis unavoidable? And high-producing farms especially were asking the question that in order to be a high-producing herd, do we just have some unavoidable levels of subclinical ketosis? Does it go hand in hand with high production? We said, well, I think we can answer that. So we actually analyzed the monthly subclinical ketosis data for 200 different Holstein herds. That's actually looking at 200,000 cows and over 500,000 lactation records. So some cows were included multiple times in this analysis. So every time they entered into a new lactation, we assessed that ketosis prevalence and then the impact of that ketosis. So here we looked at those subclinical ketosis prevalence rates for first lactation animals and older cows between 2015 and 2019. This chart here is probably a little bit different than most charts that you viewed, but what we were considering here were the production levels for animals depending on the prevalence rate of ketosis within the herd. So the x-axis down here is the annual subclinical ketosis prevalence rate of the herd. The y-axis is milk pounds, and then each of these lines is a different stage of lactation. What you can see here is that our best production levels actually happen in herds that were 5% or less for annual prevalence of ketosis. As ketosis prevalence increased, over 5%, we actually saw lower milk yield no matter what stage of lactation. Especially if we look at early lactation here, we actually saw an 8-pound difference between those herds at a 5% prevalence level versus down here, we're at a 20% prevalence level. And this is only in first lactation. We saw similar performance differences in those older cows. When we started to look at this on an energy-corrected milk basis, we wanted to tie those components back in here, we saw that those herds with annual average subclinical ketosis rates less than 5% actually had the best energy-corrected milk curves for first lactation and for older cows. So the blue line along the top here is our lactation curve in herds with an annual subclinical ketosis level of 5% or less. Same thing down here in our older cows. And we've got two other lines here, a green line to be 5% to about 10% or 10% to 20%. We actually saw no difference in the lactation curves for those herds between 5 and 20%. So realistically, it was these 5% herds that had the best performance, no matter if it was first lactation or older cows. We wanted to know if this was just in milk production. So we started to look at things like not only peak milk, but somatic cell and reproduction. First off, considering peak milk, if you look at a negative animal, so the negative animal is always going to be on the left and in green here, versus a positive animal, we saw differences in peak milk, with those differences a little bit more extreme in our first lactation animals. We also saw some differences in somatic cell by subclinical ketosis level. So those animals that were positive for ketosis also had a higher linear score on average than those negative animals. And days open was also a pretty extreme difference, especially in those first lactation animals. Realistically, over all of our data, first lactation animals were hit hardest by ketosis. We actually saw a 12-day difference in days open from a negative first lactation animal to a positive first lactation animal. When we look at survivability, we also saw survivability decrease as those animals were diagnosed with ketosis. So subclinical ketosis positive animals, first lactation, only 67% survived into the next lactation versus about 81% of negative first lactation cows. It became even more dramatic in our older cows, with only 55% of positive older cows staying in the herd to complete another lactation. We also saw those animals leaving early. So the green bars here are culled less than 60 days in milk, and the blue bars here are culled less than 150 days in milk. And you can see here too, those positive animals were much more likely to be culled early. So our overall conclusions here, those herds with a prevalence actually less than 5% for subclinical ketosis had higher production and greater persistency. We've had this long-held belief that we should stay below 10%, but we might actually have to revise that down to 5%. And although our impact on reproduction and health might not be visible at a herd level, because maybe we have too few cows to actually see it at the herd level, when we look at that individual cow analysis, we have a really clear impact when those cows are flagged for subclinical ketosis. So again, thinking back, when we use this data in our herd management and our management of our transition cows, everything affects another part of the farm. So our udder health affects our production, our disease levels affect our production, our reproduction can actually ultimately affect our management of our cows when it comes to dry period length and culling. All of these different components interact, and understanding the true cause of our transition cow issues on the farm can help us be better managers. I did want to leave you here with some overall values that you can check against your records. So grab a screenshot of this screen here and review those records and determine where you fall. So some of the major things that we want to look at here are those culls less than 60 days in milk, fresh cow new infections and dry cures, our fat to protein ratios. Even better yet is to look at those keto monitor values, our dry period length distribution that comes right off of our herd summary. Same with our calculated voluntary waiting period versus our actual voluntary waiting period. and service and preg rate on that first eligible cycle. Those last 3 values there can be found on your herd summary. The other values there are mostly found off of our fresh cow summary. So review those records, figure out where you sit today, where you've sat in the past, and you can use those to set some goals to where you want to be in the future. With that, thanks for tuning in, and I will open it up for any questions, comments, or practical applications so that you can make this data work for you on your dairy.
Thank you so much, Talia. We did have a couple questions come in. So Talia, our very first question that we had come in is, what with the impact of transition on my preg rate, what should my preg rate be?
Yeah, that's a kind of a hard question, and I get that one a lot because everybody wants to know where they should be from a benchmarking standpoint. But I always say that we really need to look at our peer benchmarks. AgSource does a really good job of breaking down our benchmarks by herd size and also by breed and production level. So before we can say, your herd should be at a 35% preg rate or 28% preg rate, I'd rather pull those values from peer values to figure out what is achievable and what is realistic for that herd. One report that is really great for this is the herd report card from AgSource. So that will actually let you see where you rank versus herds of similar size so that you know if your preg rate is appropriate for a herd of your size. But that fallback, most herds are striving for that 30%. But before I say that could be your benchmark to go by, I like to look at those, the peer herds for reference.
Great, thank you. And the last question we've had come in so far, how do I know if my somatic cell is related to my transition animals or something else?
Yeah, we definitely want to be able to rule out different causes of somatic cell. And the first thing that I do actually when I examine somatic cell on any herd is really look at those cows prior to dry off. How many cows are we drying off with a high somatic cell that have the potential to be failure to cure cows coming into that next lactation? And then really looking at those first test somatic cells. And again, I like to break that out by category. I don't really put first lactation animals in the same category as second and greater, or those heifers calving into their first lactation, just because we know those conditions are so different. So really examining, again, the dry cures, first test new infections is important. But there are some other resources out there. We can get some great data out of DairyComp and out of AgSource reports that'll let us know when infections are happening in the herd. I really like the way our udder health management report visualizes that because we look at infections in the first 40 days and then throughout the different stages of lactation. And that's going to give us a lot of information about what the source could be. Sometimes in herds, I see an increase in infections in that late lactation. So those herds those cows that are over 250 days in milk. And that is going to lead me to a whole different conclusion than those early lactation animals, because here I want to start looking at the things the cows have all been exposed to. Things like the parlor and teat-end vacuum and what conditions they've been experiencing in the parlor, or things like bedding, stuff that they've been exposed to throughout lactation. So we really need to look at all of that data in context and start breaking it out. What does somatic cell look like at dry off and fresh? What does somatic cell look at for cows through all different stages of lactation? And then what are those commonalities? What do those cows all experience together?
Great, thank you. That is all the questions that we had submitted. If anyone is interested in more information about your AgSource reports or information on an AgSource report that you currently don't have that you're interested in, please reach out to your region manager. They'd be more than happy to help you with that. If you have any other questions, you are welcome to reply to the email that we send out following the webinar with the recording. And we appreciate everyone for your time today, and we hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Yep, thanks everybody.